Our government officials are always telling us how great the economy is doing. But they're not only telling us, they're also bringing numbers, stats, and data, like the GDP reached this number, or unemployment rate fell to this number, or inflation hit this number, right? So they use these numbers and data to come across as more convincing and make it seem that they're sharing an undeniable fact. However, for us normal people or the consumers, right, things don't really seem to match that because as you can see here, US consumer sentiment falls close to record low, like lowest in 16 years, which is crazy. Because for us normal people, our experience is that the economy is not fine and generally speaking, the vibes are not great. So that's why when they polled people about this, they asked, do you trust the data reported about the economy by the federal government? Over 50% of people said no. And this poll was pretty recent in the start of this year, by the way. So the $1,000,000 question I want to explore today is, are they lying to us about the economy? / are they fudging the numbers along the way? Now, I know that a lot of people may be interested in this topic, but this matters especially to investors or traders because we really want to get to the bottom of things and know the real state of the economy or the markets in order to better position ourselves or make moves. Because, for example, if the government numbers say everything is fine, but in reality things are much worse, then we probably want to be more defensive with our portfolio, right? That's just an example. But anyhow, let us answer this question about are they lying to us / fudging the numbers. And to do so, first, let's take a look at the official story that the government is telling us, right? Well, they're saying things like the GDP for 2026 is going to be amazing. It's going to be super high. I know this was a few months ago, but they were projecting that our economy would grow a lot this year. And then in terms of unemployment rate, things look low right now, so it looks fine. And then for this brown line, that's inflation, that's going down, so that's good, right? And then for this, you can just read the title, the US consumer spending holds up better than expected. So that's good. So if you combine all that together, that is why Scott Bessent, our Treasury Secretary, says that there won't be a recession for 2026. Not to mention, we have this almost a meme at this point, the Dow Jones broke 50,000 for the first time in history, so the stock markets are obviously great as well. So if we just look at all these headline top level numbers that the government shares, it makes everything feel like amazing, right? Like it's utopia, the economy's great, everyone's doing fine. But if we dig deeper and start peeling the layers, we see that things look very different from the headline numbers. For example, some months we're like, oh, the US economy added jobs, right? That's amazing. But when we actually split that into sectors, we see that healthcare is carrying the job market and most other sectors are losing jobs steadily. So that's quite concerning. And then not to mention, if we look at just the unemployment rate, that is low and not that bad. But if we look at the underemployment rate, that is so much higher and trending up, as you can see in this chart. And then the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're the agency that does the job numbers. They're supposed to do estimates and then go back and revise in the future when they have more granular data. But they revised almost all of 2025's numbers down significantly. Like this shows total job growth was less than half that was suggested by the initial estimates. So that is kind of catastrophically worse than what we initially thought. And then when we look at the alternative or like secondary data, we see like the ADP payroll data, which is kind of more of like the ground truth data. That actually has divergence with the government numbers too, showing that things are worse at various points. And then when you look at the GDP numbers, well, there's another way to look at it, and that's through GDI, which is like the total amount of income that a country has earned in this past period. And that is supposed to be similar to GDP, but quote, GDP is more influenced by wild swings in trade flows resulting from tariffs. So when we look at GDI numbers, it's actually lower than GDP. So maybe we shouldn't be so excited about the 2026 growth rate for the economy, right? And then in terms of consumer spending, at the high level average, that looks fine. But then when we break it up into cohorts, we see that the top 20% is carrying everybody else. And if we focus on the bottom 80%, things look really bad. So once again, another example of top level average is fine, but digging deeper shows a completely different story. And then in terms of household debt, that hit a record high of 18.8 trillion in Q4 of 2025. And then in terms of credit card delinquency, that is close to, if not already surpassed, the levels of the great financial crisis of 2008. So point is, when we look at all this, there's a clear divergence or gap between what the government headline numbers are telling us versus when we look closer or like split it up into different ways, look at different indicators and so forth, right? But that comes to the question, are they actually lying though? Well, that is where I want to have some nuance, right? Because there's levels to the lying potentially. Like, first of all, there's outright fabrication. Like, let's say the government knows that the real number is 1%, but they are like, it's 5%, guys, yay! That's outright fabrication. But not everything is as brazen as that. For example, there could be politically motivated guesstimating. Like I said earlier, some government agencies, it's straight up their job and normal process to take a guess and then revise their guess later once they have better data, right? That's part of the process. But the BLS, for example, consistently overestimates jobs numbers only to be revised down later. And some people have accused them of doing this before elections to make things seem better, right? Because, if things were really bad and closer to the truth, then people would be really pissed at the politicians and the government. But anyhow, the third way is opportunistic methodology choices. And that's like the method that they calculate these numbers per se. One example of this is choosing the owner's equivalent rent, or OER, to measure housing costs and CPI, which is the inflation number, instead of other options. Because if you look into this, there's other options that get you more accurate, ground truth, real-time data for housing prices, but they chose this approach, which gives them a more favorable reading. And then lastly, just changing the definition, right? Like, people always accuse the Biden admin of changing the definition of a recession. It used to be just 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, but then they had all sorts of things and said that the agency gets to decide, and the agency said it wasn't a recession. And so point is, that also kind of decreases trust, even though it's not outright fabrication per se. So if you ask me, at least in the US, I think the more likely case is that they're not outright fabricating the numbers and lying to us, but the numbers 2 through 4, I think it's very possible that they're doing that. And a lot of the examples I just shared with you are case in points. Now, the reason why I don't think they're outright fabricating is because they are transparent about their methodologies and raw data. Like, they share all those, and then you can go spot check or crunch the numbers for yourself. And if something doesn't add up, you can call them out for it. And also, like, the revisions technically go both ways. I did say that they're biased towards guessing high and then downward revision, but the other way has happened in the past as well. And then also, like, for outright fabrication, this would require a huge conspiracy because they have like thousands of field data collectors. They have like middle managers in the offices crunching numbers, different teams, different agencies. So all of them would have to be like, this is right and there's no issue with this number. And it would have to have no one come out as a whistleblower, right? So that hasn't happened, and that's why I don't think they're straight up like making up numbers here. But it is very possible that they are biased towards taking the most optimistic yet defensible interpretation of the data, right? And that is exactly what we've seen in various situations in the past. Now, I do want to contrast this because if we want to talk about actual lies about the data, there are times in history where that's happened in other countries, like Greece. They lied about their debt and deficit numbers to join the Eurozone, and that was a huge crisis. And then Argentina, they literally fired their government statisticians to lie about the inflation numbers, and that got caught years down the line. And then China, there's no hard proof here, but they're saying that their economy is going to grow super fast this year, but it doesn't really line up with what we know about like their housing market, their demographics, and things like that, right? So they also are able to choose whatever number they want, and we don't really have a way to double check that. But yeah, I think if we take a step back and think about this, my takeaways are I don't think the government is just full on lying, but I would take all the headline numbers that they share with us on TV or on social media or on the news with a grain of salt. Instead, I would always try to think about the biases and understand the incentives here, right? And so if we can't just trust the headline data, what can we do, right? Well, we should look for a lot of alternative data sources. Like there are the ADP payroll numbers, for example, and that there's alternative data sources for every metric or indicator that you can imagine. And then I would also consider contrarian interpretations too. Like, for example, the unemployment rate is fine, but what about underemployment? And then lastly, as an investor, I would make moves based on our more detailed, accurate view of how things are. Like the example I shared with you, if things are actually worse than what the headline numbers say, then I would maybe be more defensive with my portfolio and my positioning. But yeah, that's my take. I'm really curious to hear what you think about this. And also in this channel, I want to dig into these kind of fascinating, intriguing, and even like hot and viral topics that retail investors care about. So if you have anything on your mind that you want me to analyze and break down, like any burning questions, just drop them in the comments below. And also, I greatly appreciate if you give me a like, subscribe to this channel. I'm Kevin, and I'll see you next time.